A struggling father can't afford his daughter's dream prom dress, and time is running out. Just when all hope seems lost, an unexpected encounter with NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal changes everything. But this isn't just about money. It's about dignity, community, and a life-altering lesson that goes beyond wealth. Will a father's love and a stranger's kindness be enough to create a night to remember? Or will the weight of reality crush a dream before it even begins? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun peeked through the dusty blinds of a small apartment in downtown Atlanta. The air inside was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, though the man holding the steaming cup wasn't drinking it. Jonathan Pierce, a man in his early 40s with calloused hands and weary eyes, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. His fingers drummed against the tabletop, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past few months. Money was tighter than ever, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like an unrelenting storm. Across the apartment, laughter echoed from the small bedroom. His 17-year-old daughter, Alyssa, was on the phone with her best friend, her voice bubbling with excitement. Prom was just a few weeks away, and all the girls were talking about their dresses, the perfect shoes, and the limo rides. Alyssa deserved to be part of that excitement. She was smart, kind, and had worked hard all year to maintain her grades while helping out at home. But Jonathan knew what she didn't. There was no money for a prom dress. He exhaled slowly, gripping his coffee mug as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Maybe he could pick up extra shifts at the auto shop. Maybe he could sell a few things. Maybe, just maybe, a miracle would happen. That afternoon, Jonathan stood outside Reed's Auto Repair, where he had worked for the past 15 years. He had asked his boss, Mike Reed, for an advance on his paycheck, something he had never done before. The conversation had been short, blunt, and disappointing. "John, I'd help if I could," Mike had said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But business is slow. I can barely cover payroll as it is." Jonathan had nodded, forcing a tight-lipped smile. He understood. The world didn't stop for one man's troubles. Now, as he walked home, his thoughts swirled with desperation. How could he tell Alyssa she couldn't go? How could he look into her hopeful eyes and take that joy away from her? That evening, Alyssa came into the kitchen, her curly brown hair bouncing as she moved. "Dad, I found the perfect dress," she said, pulling up a picture on her phone. "It's simple, elegant, not too expensive." Jonathan's heart clenched. Even not too expensive was out of reach. He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady, though his insides felt like they were crumbling. Alyssa hesitated. "Dad, we can afford it, right?" For a brief moment, Jonathan considered lying. But he had never lied to her before, and he wouldn't start now. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Alyssa, things are a little tight right now. Maybe we can find something more affordable." Her face fell. The light in her eyes dimmed just a little, and it shattered him. "Oh, yeah. Of course. I understand." She turned away before he could say anything else. Jonathan watched as she walked back to her room, her shoulders just a little slumped. The next morning, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, searching for anything. Side jobs, loan options, anything that could help. Every option led to a dead end. He needed help. And help, though he didn't know it yet, was about to come from the most unexpected place. Across town, Shaquille O'Neal walked into his favorite coffee shop, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, but still impossible to miss. At 7 feet tall, with a presence larger than life, he turned heads wherever he went. But Shaq didn't care about attention. He cared about people. He ordered his usual and stepped outside, enjoying the crisp morning air. A few feet away, he noticed a man sitting on a park bench, head in his hands, stress written all over his face. It wasn't the first time Shaq had seen a struggling father, but something about this man, his worn-out clothes, the tired slump of his shoulders, made Shaq pause. Jonathan sat on that bench, lost in thought. He had walked to the park to clear his head, but instead he found himself sinking deeper into despair. He didn't even notice when a shadow fell over him. "Hey, man. You good?" Jonathan looked up, startled. Standing in front of him was Shaquille O'Neal. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. He blinked twice, then sat up straighter. Yeah, just long day." Shaq studied him for a moment. "You sure?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't know why, but there was something about Shaq. Something real. Something genuine. But he wasn't about to spill his troubles to a stranger, especially not someone like Shaq. "Yeah," he said again, forcing a smile. Shaq nodded, but he wasn't convinced. He had spent years reading people, and Jonathan looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "All right, man," Shaq said, clapping Jonathan on the shoulder. "Take it easy." Jonathan watched as Shaq walked away, his massive frame blending into the morning crowd. For a moment, he wondered if he had just imagined the entire thing. Little did he know, their paths were about to cross again, this time in a way that would change everything. Alyssa sat at her usual spot in the school cafeteria, her tray untouched. The scent of greasy pizza and stale fries filled the air, but she had no appetite. Laughter and chatter surrounded her, but it all felt distant, like she was in a movie, watching everything happen from behind a thick glass wall. Across the table, her best friend Riley Dawson scrolled through her phone, grinning as she flipped through pictures of designer prom dresses. "Look at this one," Riley said, turning the screen toward Alyssa. The dress was emerald green, floor length, sleek, and expensive. "I think this is the one. My mom already put the order in." Alyssa swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "It's gorgeous." Riley beamed, oblivious to the way Alyssa's hands curled into fists under the table. She had once imagined prom as a magical night, dancing under glittering lights, feeling beautiful, like she belonged. But now it felt like a dream meant for other girls. A group of girls at the next table erupted into laughter. Alyssa didn't need to look to know who it was. Kelsey Monroe, the daughter of a wealthy lawyer, was at the center of the conversation, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "Ugh, can you imagine showing up in some off-the-rack disaster?" Kelsey said, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Prom is the most important night of high school. If you can't afford to look good, why even bother going?" The words sliced through Alyssa like a blade. She knew Kelsey wasn't speaking directly to her, but the meaning was clear enough. Before Alyssa could react, Riley scoffed. "Seriously, Kelsey? Not everyone has a rich daddy to buy them whatever they want." Kelsey smirked, completely unbothered. "Oh, come on, Riley. It's not my fault some people don't plan ahead." She flicked her gaze toward Alyssa for just a second, just long enough for the message to land. Alyssa felt her stomach twist. She couldn't sit there another second. The walls of the cafeteria felt like they were closing in, the noise buzzing in her ears like static. She grabbed her bag and stood abruptly. "I'll see you in class," she mumbled before hurrying out. Riley called after her, but Alyssa didn't stop. She wandered the halls aimlessly, trying to steady her breathing. She hated that Kelsey's words had gotten to her. But they had. And what was worse? Deep down, she wondered if Kelsey was right. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a text from her dad. "Dad. Hey, sweetheart. How's your day?" Alyssa stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she felt embarrassed, that she wished things were different, that she was tired of pretending everything was okay. But she knew how hard he was trying. She knew the late nights, the extra shifts, the exhaustion in his eyes. The last thing she wanted was to add to his stress. She took a deep breath and typed back. "Alyssa. Good. Just busy with school stuff. Love you." She hit send before she could change her mind and shoved her phone back into her pocket. That evening, Alyssa sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through pictures of prom dresses. Her eyes lingered on one, a soft blue gown with delicate beading along the waist. It wasn't extravagant, not like the ones Riley or Kelsey were getting, but it was beautiful, simple, elegant. It was the dress she had imagined herself wearing. She checked the price. Her chest tightened. Even with the on-sale tag blinking in bright red, It was still too much. Alyssa set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. She thought about what Kelsey had said. If you can't afford to look good, why even bother going? Maybe she was right. Maybe prom wasn't meant for people like her. Her bedroom door creaked open, and her dad poked his head inside. "Hey, kiddo." She quickly flipped her phone over. "Hey, Dad." Jonathan stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe. He looked exhausted. His blue work shirt wrinkled, his dark hair slightly grayer at the temples than it had been a year ago. "You okay?" Alyssa hesitated. The words were right there on the tip of her tongue. She wanted to tell him everything about Kelsey's comment, about how out of place she felt, about how much she wanted to go to prom but knew she couldn't. But then she saw the worry etched into his face, the lines on his forehead that hadn't been there when she was younger. She couldn't do that to him. "Yeah," she said instead. "Just tired." Jonathan studied her for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines. Finally, he nodded. "You know you can talk to me, right?" She forced a smile. "I know." He walked over, pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and squeezed her shoulder. "Get some rest, sweetheart." She waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the hall before letting out a slow breath. She hated this, the pretending, the half-truths. But what choice did she have? She picked up her phone, took one last look at the dress, then turned off the screen and climbed under the covers. Maybe if she told herself prom didn't matter, she'd eventually believe it. But deep down, she already knew that was a lie. Jonathan Pierce had never been the kind of man to ask for help. He prided himself on hard work, on earning every dollar with sweat and effort. But as he sat in the break room at Reed's Auto Repair, staring at his phone screen, he knew he was out of options. His bank account was nearly empty, his bills were overdue, and prom was only a few weeks away. He had promised Alyssa nothing, but that didn't change the way her face had fallen when he'd hesitated about the dress. He had to find a way. Mike Reed, his boss, walked in, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. Jonathan hesitated before speaking, swallowing his pride. "Mike, I, was wondering if I could pick up some extra shifts, nights, weekends, whatever you've got." Mike sighed, shaking his head. "John, you know I'd help if I could. But business is slow, and I'm already cutting hours where I can." He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "I'm real sorry, man." Jonathan nodded, forcing himself to accept it. "Yeah, I get it." But as he walked back to the garage, tightening his grip on his work gloves, he knew that understanding wouldn't get Alyssa that dress. That evening, after finishing his shift, Jonathan walked down the dimly lit streets of downtown Atlanta, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had already checked in with Jimmy's Diner, Quick Mart gas station, and even an overnight security job that paid under the table. Nothing. No one was hiring, at least not fast enough. The last stop on his list was Collins Pawn and Loan. It wasn't the kind of place he liked going to, but at this point, his pride mattered less than his daughter's happiness. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and old wood. The glass cases displayed watches, jewelry, and small electronics, while guitars hung from the walls, their strings collecting dust. Paul Collins, the owner, stood behind the counter, looking as uninterested as ever. Jonathan pulled a silver wristwatch from his pocket and set it on the glass. "How much can you give me for this?" Paul picked it up, inspecting it under the dim light. "It's in decent shape," he muttered. "But this ain't exactly a Rolex, John." Jonathan shifted on his feet. "I know. Just give me whatever you can." Paul smirked, shaking his head. $30. Jonathan's stomach sank. "Paul, come on. It's worth more than that." Paul leaned on the counter, looking bored. "Then sell it somewhere else." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "I need at least 100. Paul gave him a long look, then set the watch back on the counter. "Not my problem." A slow anger burned in Jonathan's chest, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't about to lose his temper in a pawn shop. Without another word, he grabbed the watch and walked out into the cool night air. By the time Jonathan got home, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He found Alyssa in her room, curled up on her bed with her laptop open. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, surprised. "Hey, Dad, you're home late." "Yeah." he admitted, rubbing his neck. Long day. She studied him for a moment, her brows furrowing. Did you eat? Jonathan smiled. You sound like your grandma. Alyssa rolled her eyes. That's not an answer. He walked over, sitting on the edge of her bed. I grabbed something earlier. Don't worry about me. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Jonathan glanced at her laptop screen. The Prom website was open, with a countdown clock ticking away the days. She noticed where he was looking and quickly closed the tab. Jonathan's heart ached. Alyssa. It's fine, Dad, she said quickly. Really, Prom's not a big deal. But it was. He could see it in her eyes. He reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Get some sleep, kiddo. She nodded, forcing a smile. Night, Dad. Jonathan left her room, his heart heavy. He had to fix this. The next morning, Jonathan's search for extra work continued. Between oil changes and brake replacements at the shop, he called old friends, checked job listings, and even considered asking his landlord for a delay on rent, though he knew it wouldn't do much good. By lunchtime, he was exhausted, his hope dwindling. He sat on a bench outside a corner coffee shop, rubbing his temples. That's when he saw him. Shaquille O'Neal. The man was impossible to miss. Tall, broad, larger than life. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other guy grabbing a morning coffee. But to the people around him, he was a legend. Jonathan had seen Shaq around the neighborhood before. He'd heard stories about how he helped people, how he walked into stores and paid for strangers' groceries, how he tipped waitresses thousands of dollars just because. He had always admired him, but from a distance. Now, as Shaq laughed with the barista inside, Jonathan hesitated. Should he ask him for help? Would it be humiliating? Would Shaq even care? The idea sat heavy in his chest, but Jonathan couldn't bring himself to do it. He stood up and walked away. That night, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table staring at his watch. $30. That's what Paul Collins had offered him. It wouldn't even cover a fraction of the dress. He turned the watch over in his hands, thinking. His father had given it to him years ago, back when times were different, when life didn't feel like an uphill battle every single day. He had always promised himself he'd never sell it, but promises didn't put food on the table. Promises didn't buy dresses. Jonathan exhaled slowly, gripping the watch tighter. He had one more place to try, and if that didn't work, he wasn't sure what he was going to do. Jonathan Pierce trudged down the cracked sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his worn-out jacket. The early evening breeze had a slight chill, but he barely noticed. His mind was too cluttered with worry, too weighed down by the feeling of defeat. He had spent the entire day looking for extra work, any opportunity to scrape together enough money for Alyssa's prom dress. And yet, here he was, empty-handed, exhausted, and out of time. He exhaled heavily as he neared a strip mall, its neon lights flickering against the dimming sky. The scent of fresh donuts wafted from Benny's Donut Shop, a small family-owned place that had been around since he was a kid. He hesitated, debating whether he should even step inside. He didn't have money to spare, but maybe a coffee would clear his mind. As Jonathan pushed the door open, the tiny bell overhead jingled. He barely paid attention to the handful of customers inside, until he noticed the 7-foot-tall man standing near the counter, Shaquille O'Neal. Jonathan stopped mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. It was one thing to see Shaq from a distance, like he had the other day at the coffee shop, but standing just a few feet away from him was something else entirely. The man was a living legend, a household name. And yet here he was, laughing with the cashier like he was just another guy stopping by for a snack. Shaq leaned against the counter, dressed casually in a gray hoodie and sweatpants. His massive frame made the tiny shop feel even smaller. He had just placed his order, half a dozen glazed donuts and a large chocolate milk, and was waiting as the cashier bagged up his items. Jonathan quickly turned toward the menu, hoping to avoid any awkward eye contact. He didn't need another reminder of how different their worlds were. One man, larger than life, with more money than he could ever spend, and the other, a father struggling to buy his daughter a simple dress. You good, big man? Jonathan stiffened. He turned slightly, realizing Shaq was looking directly at him. There was no arrogance in Shaq's expression, No expectation that Jonathan should recognize him. Just a simple, genuine curiosity.